Next is Cherise Trump on behalf of Speech First. Cherise, welcome to committee.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Serino and Ranking Member Ingram, and thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to testify today and express my support for SB 117. My name is Cherise Trump. I'm the Executive Director of Speech First, which is a national free speech organization that litigates against colleges and universities on behalf of our student members when those institutions violate their free speech rights. Over the past year alone, I have visited dozens of campuses and spoken to thousands of students. It is clear to me the serious lack of civics and education in our public schools has rendered students and faculty vulnerable to campus environments that are increasingly hostile towards free speech. For example, I spoke to a room of 50 students while visiting a college campus a few months ago, and I asked how many of them had read the U.S. Constitution. Only 5 raised their hands. Sadly, those results are not unusual. They are part of a concerning trend across American universities. The bottom line is that many students arrive on college campuses with no basic understanding of foundational principles that make up our country's legal, political, and governing structures. George Washington said, "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important?" This point is as critical today as it was in the early years of our country. If we want to protect our civil liberties, the next generation must not only understand the Constitution, but also the original ideas, debates, and philosophies that animate it. A disinterested populace that cannot be bothered with the duties associated with citizenship, led by complacent leaders who prefer that citizens don't care to inquire about their rights, is a recipe for civic disaster. Based on my experiences at college campuses across the country, I can tell you that we are on that path today. My conversations with students have exposed 3 main sentiments: fear, hate or hostility, and apathy and complacency. I frequently hear from students who fear retaliation from expressing their viewpoints, especially if those views are outside of the mainstream on their campus. They are afraid of being reported, especially by their peers, to the apparatchik that is the college administrators who are running what is commonly known as bias reporting systems. These are anonymous reporting systems where students are encouraged to inform on one another for incidents of bias, offensive speech, and bias incidents are often described as microaggressions, not using someone's preferred pronouns, offensive speech, joking, or stereotyping. In some cases, even offending someone's political affiliation is a reportable offense. All of these purported offenses, by the way, are constitutionally protected forms of speech. But do students actually know this? Or do they go along with the motion not realizing that they can push back when their rights are being violated? In Speech First, Inc. versus Fenves, the majority opinion said that bias reporting systems represent the clenched fist in the velvet glove of student speech regulation. The state of Ohio currently has 15 campuses with bias reporting systems that we know of based on the survey we took last year. Furthermore, students fear the weaponization of harassment policies, which have been commonly used to tamp down on unpopular speech by stating that, in OSU's case, for example, that unwelcome verbal conduct can actually be considered reportable harassment. So if someone decides, for example, to express their views on whether or not biological males who identify as female should be allowed to participate in women's sports, they could actually be reported for harassment. Students do not know how to engage with opposing ideas. They are constantly operating in unpredictable environments and fear that the universities do not have their best interests at heart unless they toe the ideological line or fit the mold of the political agenda of the day. A student at UC Boulder, for example, was wearing a MAGA hat and was sucker punched in the face by an African-American female for wearing this hat. This was assault. But he did not report the incident because he was so convinced that the university would not only do nothing for him, but that he actually might get blamed for the incident. And a 2021 survey from College Pulse and Real Clear Education found that a little over 20% of students felt it was okay to use violence against someone based on their speech. At the University of North Texas, an angry mob chased students a year ago who hosted a controversial speaker down the hall, and one of them actually had to hide in a closet until the mob decided to leave. I recently visited SUNY Oswego and was protested for my talk on all things free speech related. I was the first conservative speaker in over 2 years on that campus, and it was met with aggressive protests. The level of police and security required was alarming on its own. The student protesters wouldn't even stay to hear my talk about free speech, of all things, the thing that they were equating to hate speech. Meanwhile, I also hear from professors who tell me they no longer hold class discussions because they fear how students will react to one another, or that the professor himself may get in trouble for encouraging the discussion of a controversial topic. What is a controversial topic these days? I asked students this exact question. Most of them said anything that's political or related to politics. But with the level of cultural, societal issues being discussed in the political arenas today, this means virtually any issues can be off limits in the classroom. The bottom line, no one actually knows what they could get in trouble for saying. This is antithetical to the American founding principles. And how on earth could this possibly create a constructive learning environment? The hateful sentiments I often see on campus derive from students who have replaced fellowship with enmity. Students are often confronted with hours of training that focus on the many attributes which divide them rather than unite them. These trainings are known as diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Our findings show that student orientation programs exclusively steep students in all things DEI while leaving out fundamental principles like free speech and viewpoint diversity. Students begin their college careers being told they are implicitly biased against certain races and ethnicities, and that they are privileged if they look a certain way. They are told that no matter where they came from or what their background is, they have an inherent bias that they must focus on rectifying. In some cases, students are made to take implicit bias tests that ask them to match skin color with positive and negative words, and if they click too fast, they are told that they are implicitly biased, in other words, racist. This puts an undue burden on students' shoulders as they enter what is supposed to be the most rigorous and studious time of their lives. And instead of focusing on their studies, their ideas, and challenging others' ideas, they must walk on eggshells, avoid upsetting anyone with simple questions, and focus on correcting a non-existent bias that creates a sense of animosity among students rather than camaraderie. I bring up these sentiments of fear, hostility, and complacency with you here today for a reason. They all directly contribute to one of the main problems we see in society today: the inability to engage in civil discourse. The concept of civil discourse is essential to the American way of life. I'm sure it is not lost on anyone in this room that we are seeing a serious breakdown in our country's ability to articulate ideas and political solutions. I hark back to the quote from George Washington for the reasons why he prioritized an education in civics and in the science of government. It was understood then, as it should be now, that our republic is a fragile one, and it can easily collapse when we stop understanding its history, its purpose, and when we stop understanding one another. This steep decrease in student engagement with opposing or challenging ideas will ultimately hamper intellectual growth at a time when students should be challenging themselves intellectually more than ever before. Understanding America's constitutional history is fundamental to understanding the importance of our unique culture of debate and civil discourse, which are essential elements to a dynamic and spirited education. Furthermore, any citizen who plans to participate in American society must know and understand the foundational principles which make up our legal system. And ignorance of these principles will lead to the decay of such concepts as justice, equal rights, liberty, the obligations of the citizenry, as well as appropriate limitations on the government. When students lose hold of these concepts espoused in the teaching of civics, they lose the sense of ownership over their rights and their liberties. They begin to identify others who are more responsible for safeguarding their rights than they are. This should be of grave concern for anyone working towards the continuation of this republic. Participation in standing up for and defending one's rights is essential in our form of government. In fact, the only reason I can think to shield students from courses on constitutional studies or American history or civics would be for the goal of controlling and manipulating them, molding them for one's own political agenda. Because once a student has a firm grasp on their rights and obligations, they become more independent thinkers, less influenced by the whims of the prevailing dogma on college campuses, and more open to exercising their rights by participating in rigorous intellectual inquiry. Universities should be challenging students intellectually and driving them to seek truth. But in order to seek truth, one must engage in the robust exchange of ideas, a concept that has been lost on students, but that wasn't lost on our founders. When students are exposed to different and challenging ideas, they emerge stronger, smarter, and more resilient. Intellectual growth is not something that happens in a vacuum. Students must be able to express their ideas and opinions on political and social issues in order to exercise the critical thinking process that is so vital to intellectual development. All of the policies I've mentioned today are designed to create an environment of control, not safety. Students are increasingly choosing security over freedom, preferring comfort over the growing pains of intellectualism and the risks of engaging in the battle of ideas. These are the same students who will be future leaders, litigators, judges, national security advisors, tech CEOs, bankers. What outlooks and habits are they developing on college campuses that they will bring with them into the professional world? We will end up with leaders who are either disconcertingly compliant and avoid confrontation, or leaders who have totalitarian penchants, encouraged by those who agree with them. Free speech, civil discourse, civic duty, and a free society. These are principles we all hold dear in this country, but they are disappearing from college campuses. Everyone in this room should want our institutions to teach and embody these virtues that have made this country great. These are concepts that unite us as well as all Americans. And these are concepts that should be understood by every citizen in this country. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Senator Rulli has a question.
Thank you so much for coming to testify today. I'm curious your comments of what I'm going to say right now. So one of the most controversial figures in America right now is Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire. And so we have a tale of two cities. We have Matt Walsh going to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and we have Matt Walsh coming to Ohio State University. So my interpretation of whatever your public speaker is when it's coming to a university is how that university handles a controversial speaker on either side of the political aisle. And I'm going to take my hat off to the Ohio State University because they not only had Matt Walsh there, but they also had a pro-life day there. Now, the beautiful thing about it is there were a lot of protesters outside protesting those two speakers, and that is our American right to do. But Ohio State did it in a way where everyone was safe. Nobody was targeted. Nobody was, felt threatened. And the beautiful thing of our college campuses on both political parties actually worked. So Ohio State did a great job. Carnegie Mellon did a horrible job. I believe there was a Molotov cocktail thrown, people had stitches, and it was mayhem. So how do universities and colleges protect both sides of the political argument, which is what we want in the universities? If, that saying, prove me wrong, I love it when someone from the opposite party proves me wrong, because I'm not perfect. I'm wrong about a lot of things. I mean, it's just human beings, but don't you think we need to really judge our higher ed, how they handle these speakers? I'm very curious of your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I've seen examples where administrators encourage and goad protesters to actually take it to the next level, that actually say that they support everything that they're doing, including the shouting down of a speaker, which, by the way, students routinely do not understand the difference between exercising your right to free speech and then supposedly exercising your right to remove someone else's right to free speech. And this is something that I think a civics and free speech education would be particularly helpful in explaining to them, that if you protest, that is protected, but if your protest prevents the other person from speaking, then that is no longer constitutionally protected speech. Additionally, it really comes down to holding administrators and students who behave in the rioting and mob mentality way accountable for their actions. I think we saw an example at Stanford Law School where Dean Steinbach, the law school's DEI dean, actually stood up, prevented the judge from speaking, encouraged the students, who, by the way, were spitting on a Fifth Circuit judge and shouting at him that his children should die. These, not the behavior you would expect of law school students, that she actually encouraged them and asked them the question whether the juice was worth the squeeze. And she was referring to whether or not free speech was worth it if you had to hear opposing ideas. And of course it is, right? Of course it is worth the squeeze in this country. We believe that firmly. And we have stated that in, time and time again with Supreme Court rulings saying that there is no offensive speech exception to the First Amendment. And I think holding bad actors like Dean Steinbach accountable for their actions, actually showing and setting example, will create the real deterrent effect that we're looking for here. Because it really comes down to, are you trying to deter future behavior where people are breaking windows, throwing Molotov cocktails, lighting effigies of the speakers on fire, spitting on them? That is not free speech. That is chaos. And that is something that definitely needs to be reined in on campus.
Question? Senator Ingram?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. And I see in your testimony that part of what you're talking about, of course, is freedom of speech. And then we continue to quote our forefathers, Washington and Jefferson and folks like that. And unfortunately, remember, to get to where we are right now, many of those freedoms were not applied to everybody. So when we talk about civil discourse, the DEI was intended not to separate, and unfortunately this is what I'm hearing from campus to campus, or what the proponents are alluding to, How do we fix that with eliminating the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece of that when the intent is to get us to the ability to live together as equal as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth recognizing absolutely our historic shortcomings as a nation, but I think also that it's important to recognize that everyone today is protected by these rights, and to actually not try. A big part of it is you can teach history, truthfully, but at the same time emphasize the fact that we all have access to these free speech rights. Viewpoint diversity is very important to a college campus experience. And for example, in freshman orientation programs, when we did a survey last year, we did actually FOIA requests asking for materials from 50 of the major state universities, asking what their freshman orientation materials actually looked like. And 91% of them focus on DEI topics, and this is things like microaggressions, trigger warnings, critical race theory, even some political advocacy for groups like Black Lives Matter and things like that, and racial disparities and things on sex and gender. So all of that emphasis, by the way, of all those universities, only 30% of them even mentioned free speech or viewpoint diversity once. And of those that mentioned free speech and viewpoint diversity, it was still a 7-to-1 ratio on DEI topics to the topics of free speech. So if you're going to talk about those issues and really address them, I think it's really, really important that you also remind students that they're all in this together right now on college campuses. There needs to be more unifying language, because right now the emphasis is on things that divide them. And that's what they're embodying when they go into campus. And it doesn't help that, you have freshman orientations at the beginning that start with that mentality, and then you end it with, for example, segregated graduation programs. So, the fact that students are expected to participate in graduation separately when they all just went through something for 4 years together, right, as friends, as fellows. This should be something that's celebrated. They shouldn't be encouraged to do these things separately. Again, it's about unifying the country, not dividing it more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. A black graduation is not necessarily a black graduation that the institution has decided that we will have a black graduation and a white graduation. Many of those students, because of their heritage, have decided to do that for themselves. Unfortunately, part of what we do is that we dictate what folks should be thinking. For instance, here at the State House, we have things that would eliminate DEI. And so therefore, with that elimination, we're getting to whatever course material or whatever coverage or curricula that you want to see that's dictated by whom. And you're absolutely right. We go from one side to the other. If you disallow the others to have a voice, then you've taken away their freedom of speech also. Here at the State House, we have bills like in the last General Assembly, House Bill 322, House Bill 327, which dictated that you could not teach certain things. Right now, I'm hearing in Florida that all of those programs have been eliminated, and we start to take out folks who are, or to fire the board of directors at a particular higher education institution because we don't like the way that they're doing things. If there is a way to resolve this, there has to be a conversation from both sides and not always this argument about who's right. If we're getting the civil discourse, as I spoke once to Sandra Day O'Connor, and she talked about civics, and we talked about the importance of that into our education of our pre-K-12 students. But the reality is that if the intent is to get them to somewhere where we all agree we live the life that some folks have decided and not the life that they themselves have decided, then we've done them a disservice, and it's not just the civics piece of it. But I want to know, though, in your mind, I'm going to ask this question to everybody probably, where does the coursework come from? Who determines what gets done in these institutions that here right now are only at Toledo and Ohio State with an appropriation? What gets taught?
Yeah, I want to address a couple of points on what you mentioned with regards to DEI first. So some of the issues that we're seeing with DEI, and I would like to first acknowledge also that within the DEI kind of apparatus, all of those who are working on this issue and who exist, whether it be in the private sector or in the public sector, there's actually quite a bit of disagreement amongst those individuals about what is actually appropriate in pursuing DEI initiatives, what tactics are appropriate, because a lot of the times we do see, and I think they even acknowledge on their side that there's too much division being caused by some of these initiatives. For example, those bias reporting systems that I laid out for you, those are actually, most of them are housed in DEI offices. Most of them are managed by DEI officers. They are anonymous reporting systems where students are supposed to report on each other. This isn't something that encourages unity. Again, also, they are the ones who often will say that there are policies against microaggressions. When I ask students what a microaggression is, they will say it could basically be anything. We don't know what it is until you commit one. And that's not really, you can't go around campus not knowing if you're going to offend someone with a reportable offense that could lead to real disciplinary action. Additionally, DEI has infiltrated STEM fields in a way that has actually put us behind on many of our STEM research, because most professors now have to, when they're applying for grants, have to explain why their scientific research is going to help underrepresented minorities, even in research that is completely irrelevant to that topic. For example, Professor Wailicki at the University of Alabama wanted to study a crater, and he wanted to study the expansion of a crater, but instead had to spend weeks trying to figure out how to explain to the board why his crater was going to help underrepresented minorities. Additionally, the amount of disagreements that are, again, like I said, that are being laid out in debates, actually, being held on campuses. I think there was a debate recently at MIT, and I think it was actually hosted by ACTA and Braver Angels. And that debate actually laid out a lot of the many disagreements amongst those in the DEI field about what actually is productive and what is efficient. So I think it's about a little bit of self-reflection is needed there as well. To answer your question about where these materials are going to come from, I think a lot of them are pretty basic when it comes to like what's going to explain the legal foundational principles of this country, which would be the actual documents themselves, original documents, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, what were the founders writing about, what were they thinking about, what were their debates at the time. That kind of stuff, that philosophical thinking, that exercise will help establish the foundation necessary for students to then pursue these other ideas, these questions of equality or diversity and equity and inclusion. They need that foundation to build off of, though, to know that civil discourse is a priority in this country because it is basically at the core of our culture. We don't have a demographic culture in this country. We have a political one. Our culture is all about debate and discussion and on political ideas that make up our society. And so that is something that students really need to come away with. And I think just giving them access to those basic documents is key. I mean, like I said, 5 students out of 50 raised their hand, and this was an elite institution. Elon University is a private school. It's well known in North Carolina. And 5 out of 50 raised their hand for even having read the Constitution. If you're going to argue that the Constitution is racist or you don't like it, that's one point. But to not even have read it, that's another question.
Okay, one more, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that. But I want to make sure that when we're talking about the Constitution, you're absolutely right. They should know it. I don't know if they should have read all of the Federalist Papers because, they're back and forth and all over the place. And, of course, we have right now the notion that with American history that we're going to choose 5. Somebody's going to choose 5 to read them. Mm-hmm. I would shudder to think who's going to choose the 5 and which 5 they would choose. So my concern is that when we talk about using the Constitution, we have got to be in a position to be able to move those documents forward as to what they mean for the people now. Because remember, many of those documents did not include many people who are represented in those classrooms and are represent me here now. Am not in any of those. Even Jefferson's paper, those papers that were written. How does that happen and moving that forward? And I know you can do that in a civil way, but how do you do that and make sure that it is included and that we don't just get back to what our founding fathers said?
Right. Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that, the Constitution itself lays out the model for our governing structure. Students need to understand how it works. They need to understand what it says. We can debate about whether or not these ideas transcend, right? Transcend over time. I believe that they do. I believe the idea of free speech, it should be applicable to all, and whether or not it was applicable back then, it is now. And so that's something that needs to be emphasized. But looking through the documents, most of them are really just laying laying foundation for our legal system and our governing structures. And this is so vital and important for students to understand if they plan to participate in political discussions.
Thank you. We're going to move along here. I did have, before we release you here, by the way, I don't want to harp on this, but I want to mention, for many of you who haven't testified before, when you're responding, you go through the chair and then indicate the senator whose question you're answering here, just to follow our protocol. I wanted to ask you about compelled speech, because a lot of people don't understand it and think of restricted speech as really the thing that we all need to pay attention to. But compelled speech in the minds of many is actually more egregious in some respects, because you're telling people what to believe. Just very briefly, please, how have you run across that on campuses in your work?
I think the most clear example of compelled speech that I've seen is the compelled use of pronouns and gender affirmation language. This is a very, very clear example. Compelled speech is fundamentally unconstitutional. It is a violation of the First Amendment rights of students. When students, as much as you have the right to say what you want under the First Amendment, obviously prohibiting certain legal precedents, that you also have the right to not say things that you don't believe in. What we're seeing right now, what I'm concerned about, is these new Title IX rules that are coming down the pike. Because right now, a lot of harassment policies on college campuses that currently exist include gender identity as a protected class. The federal statute will basically formalize that and put it at the federal level and include gender identity as a protected class as well. But it will also remove a very important standard for which kind of speech can be considered harassing conduct. And that standard is vital to the protections that students have right now. And removing that will open them up to basically what we see in Canada, where people can be reported for Title IX sexual harassment for not using someone's pronouns, or a faculty member accidentally using a dead name. Students will actually have the means necessary to actually report these things as Title IX sexual harassment. In Canada, they currently jail people for this. So I would really like not to start down that path.
Great. Hopefully we can raise awareness to the compelled speech issue, because it really is not talked about very much here. Well, thank you very much for your testimony. If there are no further questions, thank you.
Thank you.